I'll use that as my segue to the GennAI Lens, where I have used generative AI myself to generate the next set of questions. And so I hope as students learn as well, it's okay to use generative AI in certain use cases, but then it's about critically assessing where they're useful or not. So even as I generated these questions, I verified them for accuracy. I tried to make sure that they aligned with my flow of conversation and then did some refinement myself. So adding a bit of the background of even how I generated these questions. So there's two questions in this section. One is more about the tech itself, the integration of responsible AI and ethics in that technology. And then the second set of questions is generated to go a little bit deeper on that thread we've already started around personal drivers and motivations. So the first set of questions are around the AI ethics and technology. And what are you feeling today in terms of questions 1, 2, or 3?
Let's go with 2.
Okay. AI autonomy. Do you believe there's a point where we should grant certain AI systems legal personhood or rights? What's your moral threshold for this?
Wow, that's a spicy one. So my thinking, we talk a lot about the Overton window of what would be typically considered normal to think about or to talk about. I feel like the Overton window on the issue of AI autonomy, personhood, sentience has shifted significantly in a very short period of time. I ask this question a lot inside my company, and there are a lot of people thinking about this. The question that was posed back to me when I asked some of my colleagues was, does it matter if you're interacting with something that is expressing feelings, is expressing pain, is expressing all of the feelings and emotions that human beings express in a way that is either positive or negative? Maybe you as a person have a moral obligation to treat it as though those are true, valid emotions and feelings and experiences. Because then what does it mean about what does it do for your morality and your sense of a person and your value? I thought that was a really interesting way to think about it, that the question is not centered around, hey, can we prove that this machine has reached some, we use some evals or something, and we prove that it has reached sentience or personhood. But it's actually a question of yourself around where your line is in, what you believe your obligation is vis-a-vis another being. I think the conversation is very similar to some of the animal rights or animal welfare conversations. Do we treat cows and pigs differently because they're not human beings and so we can factory farm them or, eat them without any sense that there is a moral question there? Or as a living, breathing creature, their mothers and fathers and children, do we have an obligation to treat them differently? And I think it's the same question that we're going to each have to ask ourselves personally vis-a-vis this technology. I have wondered, though, about this because, I mentioned earlier that the big promise around AI and reaching AGI was this AI utopia where we all get to go on vacation and these machines are doing all the tedious things that we didn't want to do. But if we do get to a point where there is AGI and there is a question around our moral obligation and whether these things are sentient or whether they have rights, does that undermine the notion of the AI utopia entirely? Like a thing rises to the level of, me deciding that I should treat it as though it is a person. How can I then go force it to do all these horrible things that I wouldn't want people to be doing? So I think that's probably more of an intellectual question at the moment, but something I think about as we keep moving towards this new world.
What a thoughtful response to a spicy question. Because it's such a complex space and it brings in so many different considerations around technology, personhood. Yes, and what even are these concepts around sentience and consciousness and otherwise. And then what are its implications, both for us and then for the technology itself? But I do think that our listeners will be a little bit comforted to know how deeply some of these companies who are advancing some of this state of art technology are thinking about this. And it doesn't mean that they have all the answers. It doesn't mean that we've already solved it, but these are really complex human driven questions. And for years, I'd worked on the question at Google with philosophers, with historians, with people who are experts in neurology and all these different things to try and advance some of our understanding around it. So, and again, like as a person who grew up in a very religious household as well, it raised a lot of questions around that, like what it means for religion, personhood, and souls, and everything like that. So it's super complex, but I think our listeners will be comforted by the fact that deep thought experts are wrestling with this before we get to that stage, not, oh, we've now reached this stage, what do we do now? And I think that's a common thread in what we talk about in these sessions is the control we have, the choices we make now, and the repercussions for that in the future. Okay, then the second one is on the personal drivers. And so how are you feeling for question 1, 2, or 3 for the generative question on this one?
Let's go with 3.
3. Childhood influence. What specific experiences from your upbringing most influences how you approach ethics in technology today? You shared a little bit of that earlier, so I guess the generative AI is asking you to go a little bit deeper on your childhood influence.
So I think there isn't one particular experience, but I am what you would call Gen X millennial cusp. And so, people talk about this generation as one of the most unique generations because we existed in society before the explosion of pervasive technology. I remember not having cell phones, not having pagers. If I wanted to connect with my parents as a child, if they wanted to know where I was, I had to find a payphone, make sure I had a quarter, remember their phone number, and hope that when I called them, they would happen to be at home or wherever they were by their phone to get my call. And over time, then there were pagers, then there were cell phones, then there were smartphones. And now my children have grown up in a world where iPads have always existed. Like there was never a time when iPads didn't exist. And I think growing up in that generation where I still remember what it was like to be truly disconnected and to have what I feel was true privacy makes you really look at all these technological developments and the way they've affected society and the way they've affected each future generation with a very critical lens. And I think that perspective and that frame of reference is so essential as we continue to build more and more technologies that are just pervasive across every area of our lives, from our social life to our work lives and everywhere in between. Tech is everywhere. I can work wherever, whenever, because I have a smartphone, because we have Wi-Fi, because I have a laptop now. And that was not always the case. There were different separations around when you worked because you couldn't do work from home. All the infrastructure and the technology wasn't there. And that has changed how we live. It changes our relationship with each other. It changes everything from just like, what is a work day? What are those hours to, how attached are we to and connected are we to these machines, these devices, this technology, as well as other people? And then how do we communicate? That's probably, I don't know, is that a helpful, I hope that answered the question, but it was more of a perspective rather than a particular experience.
No, it definitely was an experience. I think it resonates with a lot of people in a similar position. I remember growing up, essentially, it was the latchkey kids where we were sent out to play all day and it was come home by dinner time and that was it. There was no way to contact us until that time happened. I remember when me and my sibling got our first mobile phone. It was an ugly big thing that we had to share. And it was only because we were playing a lot of after school sports. And so our parents knew essentially when to pick us up or if something happened, maybe it was cancelled because growing up in Ireland, a lot of cancellations due to the rain or anything like that. So they'd have to come. But it was very shared, both from a affordability perspective. And my family didn't have a lot of money to just be buying all this new technology, but also the fact that like, well, you only need it for this purpose, therefore you don't need your own. And that's how like everyone has it ubiquitous all the time. But the second point that it brought to mind about this kind of generational difference as well is I was talking to people of the younger generation and they were Like, I have to say, one of the parts I was concerned about from the conversation is they just take it for granted that they don't have any privacy, that they will never not be known online. And that concerns me because I think part of maybe then this generation that we grew up in, we saw what it was like before. With all these changes, we saw that, wait, this is different. This is maybe not acceptable. We shouldn't just, and I think part of that is part of our drivers of getting into some of this work is we see what it could and should be and what we shouldn't just give up essentially for free. And you and I working around the privacy space in responsible AI and trying to make sure all these guardrails are built in and that people understand them and that there is that sense of control. And to hear from Gen Z, your generation saying, there's no privacy, so like, why do I care? I'm like, no, rail against the system, rail against what you see as something that maybe isn't right, maybe isn't acceptable, but against because they've grown up in this way, it feels like, well, it's already done. And so we shape it. We need to make sure we feel that autonomy to inform these types of things. So that did stand out as a generational difference. It's certainly something to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the sad part is true privacy is so exciting. It feels liberating. It's freeing. I hope we can find ways, or current generations can find ways to have that experience. And I think the sad part is that because everything is so pervasive, technology is so pervasive, we are all connected all the time. And there's probably emotional, psychological feelings of FOMO that exacerbate this. But if one could experience what that felt like, it is truly unique. It's a truly unique and special feeling.